So before going further, I'd like to address an issue you might have. In other tutorials, you might see them using an ORM library such as SQL to make SQL queries to the database. I won't use any ORM in this course, and in this section I'll try to explain my rationale as to why. So first let's discuss what an ORM is. An ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping, and it's essentially a library that sits in between your app and your database, and it allows you to make SQL queries a little bit easier. And an ORM has its own syntax and its own way of making SQL queries. And there's nothing wrong with using an ORM. I personally just prefer working directly with the SQL. When I first started web development, I worked directly with the SQL, and it's what I've grown used to. I honestly just find it easier than working with an ORM. And even though an ORM's job is to make SQL queries easier, I just find it easier just to work directly with the SQL. So the second reason I don't use an ORM library is because SQL gives you a more fine-grained control over the code. Because as mentioned, an ORM sits between your app and the database. So it's just an extra layer or middleman between you and your database. And because of this, you can't really do everything you can with SQL in an ORM, and which gives you less fine-grained control over your database. Now on to the third reason. The third reason I don't use an ORM is there's a lot more resources on SQL. So if you have an error or a question in your code, it's much easier to find a solution for SQL than it is for an ORM library. You know, SQL has been around for decades, so it's had a huge time to get refined and perfected and have a lot of documentation and resources for SQL. And this isn't the case for ORM libraries. So basically, the amount of documentation and resources for learning SQL gives it a huge advantage over ORM libraries. And the last reason I directly use the SQL is because the ORM library takes time to learn, and the knowledge isn't transferable to anything else. And SQL is the most used database language by a very wide margin. Last time I checked, it's around 90% of commercial databases used SQL. And learning one SQL system such as PSQL will allow you to directly transfer those skills and knowledge to another SQL system such as MySQL. And again, the ORM library, you can't transfer any of those skills or knowledge. It's when you learn that ORM library, you just learned that one. And so yeah, so those are my reasons for not using an ORM library, and I highly recommend you do the same. And an ORM is just another layer of complexity you're adding to your app. For example, if there might be some breaking changes with updates to the ORM, you have to go back in your code and make your syntax work with the updated version of the ORM. And this is not true for SQL. SQL has been the same for a very long time, and the breaking changes are very rare. So with an ORM, you're just adding another layer of potentially unnecessary complexity to your app, which will make your app less reliable.